While Star Citizen's gargantuan assets are mighty impressive, the smaller details of its game world on the micro scale can be incredibly complex. Just like the game's larger objects, managing to create detail on the small scale necessitates some smart design. Without such smart design, lots of unique detail compounding with large scales can easily mean poor performance. So in this second episode of this mini-series on Digital Foundry covering Star Citizen, I'm going to showcase how Star Citizen's developers are managing to create extremely detailed models, effects, and other simulation aspects, and how the workflows creating this detail smartly manage to not break performance. Both solutions that the game developers have created for Star Citizen 3.8 and how this game will manage performance into the future. So let's get up and peer closely into how Star Citizen creates all of its high fidelity micro details. Large objects with a lot of detail. That idea encapsulates a lot of what I saw in my visit at Cloud Imperium Games' office in Wilmslow. And really, one of the best representations of this mantra is found in the game's particle rendering system. As I showed off in my last video, massive particle storms can billow across a planet's surface affected by local weather conditions and climate properties. Looking good on that macro scale is just one part of the game's design, as the developers did not want detail to break down when you get into the thick of that storm. To do this, Star Citizen's engine needed to unify particles with many other systems and massively ramp up how many particles can be spawned at a time. To increase particle count in general, that meant switching the particle generation over to the GPU, a common practice in current generation game engines, which massively increases the amount of particles being spawned as the relative cost is much lower than particles being handled by the CPU. By being able to spawn thousands and thousands of particles in the player view, creating phenomena like massive storms is much more attainable. But that is not actually enough, and for a number of reasons. The first of which is that particles spawned on the GPU, or really any GPU effect, in general is rather ephemeral. They only really exist in a fake kind of way. GPU particles only exist within the constraints of screen space, and do not collide with the game's geometry. Rather, just with the more or less 2D depth buffer generated from that geometry. So that is why in many games, moving the screen around can cause weird artifacts with GPU particles, where you see them spawning in again or interrupting their flow. Or that's why they can show cases of depth discontinuity, like you can see here in Doom 2016, where the GPU particles spawning in front of the shotgun here ripple weirdly off the shotgun at the wrong depth. If GPU particles had those limitations on the scale of massive mountains or valleys for a storm, the artifacts would be extreme and actually pretty distracting. So to solve this, designers looked to utilize the systems from unified planet generation. So the GPU particles on planets in Star Citizen collide in screen space and as a result of that generated height map of the terrain. With this, they conform along the ridges and valleys far into the distance, and do not disappear or get weird as the camera moves. Although thousands and thousands of particles may sound like it might be enough, real storms are in fact made of billions of facets, which would tank GPU performance. To keep performance up and particles suitably dense, the GPU particle system adjusts level of detail based upon camera distance along that height map. Here you can see this in a debug view, how the density of particles close to the camera numbers in the thousands and thousands, and then the cascades into the distance lessen the particle amounts. With the amount of particles in place, the next step is to make them sit well along the terrain and not look out of place. To do this, Star Citizen's graphics programmers unified particle lighting and shadowing with the lighting and shadowing of the rest of the game's opaque geometry. So all local light sources and shadows apply to GPU particle effects, producing cool phenomenon like volumetric looking shadows coursing through particle flurries. Here, to keep performance high, particle lighting is decoupled from the rest of the lighting, kind of like you might have seen in Alien Isolation or Doom 2016, where particles are shaded and shadowed based upon a simplified tiling scheme. Terrain is of course not the only large feature that particles need to interact with. Ships in Star Citizen can be massive. To ensure GPU particles do not artifact or behave oddly with such large structures such as ships, CIG implemented a signed distant field representation into the game engine. Put simply, signed distant fields are simplified volumetric representation of game objects and have been used across a handful of games in the later part of this console generation to enable unique effects and rendering techniques. Signed distant field representations are important because physics collisions for thousands of particles being tested against a complex mesh on the CPU where that collision mesh resides would be impossibly expensive. The SDF representation on the GPU being used for this collision testing is much faster. And anything in game can really be made to have an SDF representation with which particles can collide and interact with, even the digital Foundry logo. With the SDF structure existing on the GPU and existing in real 3D space, GPU particles in their thousands can cheaply bounce around it, adhere to it, or do whatever they really want without those discontinuities of being purely in screen space. Leveraging this property, the game developers can then simulate unique particle effects with volumetric properties, like the ability for a ship to burst through a cloud of vapor and have that vapor wrap around and turbulence around the ship. Or like you can see here, a wind tunnel can be made where the stream of vapor moves around the ship's profile even though the emitter for that particle is somewhere off screen. Or something like GPU spawned rain particles that adhere to the surface of a ship, as you can see here, where the ship velocity and movement and its direction changes how the particles move on the glass surface, pooling and trickling around. This is something you can see on the glass canopies of ships as you go through atmosphere, or even on your character helmet when you find yourself in very humid environments. It can even enable some exotic science fiction effects like you can see here, where thousands of particles are moving around the speeder like some sort of alien shield tech is repelling them. Particles in a vacuum are neat, of course, but they really come together to form moody scenes when they are found in environments of equal level of detail. To enable high amounts of detail on ships or on man-made environments, CIG adapted a very specific asset creation workflow to extract as much detail as possible in real time on modern GPUs and CPUs. Traditionally, assets like a larger spaceship would be meticulously built out in an ultra-dense mesh with millions of polygons where each and every bolt, crevice, and loop is modeled out. Then an in-game mesh of lower quality would be made to similar size specifications, but devoid of much of that detail. To re-add the appearance of that detail, an artist would bake out normal maps made from the ultra-dense mesh that I mentioned earlier, and would overlay that onto the surface of the in-game model. This works out pretty well, but it has some problems when we're looking at large objects with a lot of detail. For one, the relative detail that you can see up close is limited by the overall polygon count for the ship and the resolution of individual normal maps you might see on it. It's pretty common in any modern game to just walk up to an object and see that the detail on its surface is just a flat texture. And furthermore, that detail, as you get closer, looks pixelated actually. This process also has the problem that it creates unique textures. If you have all these unique textures across the surface of a large object, that takes up a lot of memory. Star Citizen, in comparison, uses a more modern approach to asset creation to reduce texture requirements and enable an easy in-engine swapping of materials and customization for players. It also allows, in general, greater fidelity than that traditional approach. It works like this. As a base, a character or a prop will have a more traditional master material assigned to it and 4 sub-materials that are allocated in different portions across that object. That could be just enough to cover a simple object, but it could be limiting like the traditional method. For one, there would be limits to the diversity of materials on more complex objects with that sub-material system. Secondly, it has the problem for asset reusage. Star Citizen is such a huge game that designers cannot be making completely bespoke materials for just one game object. To cut down working time for an entire universe of game objects, the developers want to share materials between them, both to create consistency for in-game universe manufacturing and so the quality stays up as less individualized bespoke assets are needed to be made. So alongside this material system, there is a layering hierarchy for props and characters which enables more diversity and detail while allowing for shareability of materials. These layers are tileable detail textures to represent the cracks on leather, the mesh of an armor, or the weave pattern of cloth. Through the use of a separate blend map, an asset's material look can be created by blending between these layers to create further variation and detail. If set up correctly by an artist with heavy usage of this layer system to extract detail on an object's surface, all of these submaterials can be collapsed into a single draw call, as all of those layers are arranged into a text array indexed dynamically on the GPU, significantly speeding up their rendering. So instead of having separate draw calls for the materials on the pants and then the materials on a shirt of a character, this indexed list of materials layers makes those different materials a single draw call. So along with the art reusage due to tiling and cheaper cost, this system allows for greater customizability as well. Players can vary the color and materials set up on their character to their liking, as the layers are being swapped out in real time. And to prevent every layer from looking unnaturally uniformly pristine, the wear and tear layers can be blended in real time as your character uses that asset in game. On top of this layered material approach, CIG also uses another technique in asset workflow to add medium-sized and micro-sized detail on objects with parallax occlusion mapped trims and decals. It works like this. Each geometric asset in the game has access to an atlas of parallax occlusion map details. Asset builders then use these bits and pieces from this commonly referenced set of parallax occlusion map details to fill out middle-sized and small-sized inner surface details on objects. A great example are the tiny bolts and screws you will see on flat surfaces, or any of the smaller in-cut and inlay details found scattered across the game objects. This is not too common of a workflow, as parallax occlusion maps are usually used for planar static objects in games, like ground terrain, or on elongated surfaces with raised detail in outcroppings, kind of like bricks found on a wall usually. In Star Citizen, POM is found across movable objects, weapon models, character armor, and really almost anywhere in the game, even on the sides of giant skyscrapers. The reason why it works so well in Star Citizen here is because the objects are planned with specific aspects of detail being made with POM in mind, and it is utilized in a way to maintain the illusion of geometric depth and avoid grazing angle views, which normally break the illusion that POM provides, as you can see here. If the detail is small enough where a silhouette of that detail is not visible 99% of the time, or where that detail only exists as a cutout into the surface, then it is pretty perfect for parallax occlusion mapping. Toggling these parallax occlusion map details on and off in the game shows how incredibly important it is to Star Citizen's basic asset setup, where much of the game's apparent detail on a surface disappears when parallax occlusion mapping is disabled. The detail put into particle effects and the unique asset workflow come to a head in the game's ship damage system, which, like the particles and assets, functions in a unique way to preserve performance, increase fidelity, and reduce the time in game production. In most games, object damage is usually handled by swapping out the model in real time with a broken one. Boxes in Half-Life 2 are a great classic example of this. The pristine box model is swapped out with an exploded one where each individual piece has physics. It has two states essentially, broken and not broken. The gameplay CIG wanted for their ships needed to be more graduated than just pristine and destroyed. With that traditional method of model swapping, that would mean creating models and texture sets for each and every small bit of damage that a ship can incur. A wing being clipped, or a hole being added to the ship, or the nose being shot off. In having all these variations of damage, that would mean paying a huge cost in memory since they need to be swapped out on demand. And an artist would spend a ton of time to model out these things and create the LODs for them. And even in the end, these damage variants would not actually line up properly with where and how the ship was shot up. To avoid these problems and maintain an even higher fidelity, CIG implemented a procedural damage system. In this system, a ship has an object space damage map, which is essentially the ship model in an unwrapped form as a texture. Here, each pixel on that damage map can record 4 types of damage and blend them in real time. It covers thickness damage, where holes can be made in metals by clipping away the pixels to hide the ship model in that area, revealing the ship's skeleton frame model below. It covers burn damage, where scorching textures are blended in with varying intensity. It covers temperature damage, where emissive glow textures are blended in to show metal being superheated after being hit. And it covers deformation damage, where textures blend in to change the surface normal, making it look like a dent has occurred. In those areas where a wing can be blown off or a tail fin can be blown off, the breaking points are designated, and this procedural system varies the look of that breaking point so that the break looks different each time it happens depending upon how it was shot. In the end, the system can represent pixel-accurate damage exactly where a shot is registered, with the type of damage and weapons type influencing the subsequent spark and GPU particles that come out. And underneath the ravaged surface of a ship's exterior, you can see the inner frame of the ship kitted out with detail modeled out with parallax occlusion mapped decals. These are just some of the systems and asset workflows I saw while I was at CIG to enable this game's ambitions. Others, like the local light bounce from character flashlights, or the absurdly systemic and detailed character actor status system, which ties in your character animations such as shaking and breathing into the environmental conditions, or the automated regression testing for graphics problems, are really interesting in their own right, but they're out of the scope of this video, unfortunately. Of those things that I could cover, the particle system, the asset creation, and the like, these are all systems designed around extracting a lot of detail while staying individually optimized for performance. On top of them, there are other, more far-reaching performance optimizations that are currently being worked on or have been just added to Star Citizen 3.8. If you remember in the video I made in 3.7, I discussed a number of hurdles to be overcome until Star Citizen becomes the game that it aims to be. It is still not a massively multiplayer game, but one of those hurdles has been surpassed in the release of Star Citizen 3.8. That is the hurdle of object container streaming. As I mentioned in the last video on scale, the game's size and detail of its objects necessitates the world being split up into object containers. These are then streamed in and out on the fly as your player view changes. Before 3.8, this technology was limited to the player client, and the servers were having to simulate and load up most of the world without this streaming. This required inordinate amounts of processing power and memory. 3.8 changes this. In this test scenario, you can see how a server without object container streaming sees its internal frame rate degrade dramatically as more entities are added and are interacted with during a game session. On the right-hand side, you can see that same server under similar conditions with server object container streaming on. This server has a much more stable and consistent frame rate for its simulation, and the utilized RAM is dramatically lessened. Server object container streaming is important for two reasons. Like the example here shows, it is dramatically important for performance. The higher the server simulation frame rate is, the less rubber banding or input latency you will feel as a client. The game just feels better to play and has less jitters. The second reason why server object container streaming is important is because it is the necessary building block for server meshing. Server meshing is the core technological step for making Star Citizen into an MMO. It describes the technology to allow multiple servers to work in cooperation to greatly increase the simulation scope and player count in the game. Server object container streaming integrates like this into server meshing. As an object container is not needed, it is streamed out, and it basically preserves the state of that object container in a closed form. The system remembers the state of all the objects in that object container for storage. That could mean the persistent placement of objects in there, the AI routines there, anything. While player characters are not interacting with that closed object container, a simulation server in the background can apply macro universe simulations to them for what happened with the AI or economy or anything in the background as players were not there. The passage of time is simulated essentially. Then the closed object container can be shuffled to another server as players re-enter it, and they will see its changed state from the last time it was closed as time has passed there, and it was simulated by the background server. In the shuffling and reopening and closing of object containers between servers based upon player location, multiple servers are essentially working together and spreading the load of simulation and interactions. You can have dramatically more players and persistent stats and more AI that can be accounted for. Server meshing is really the moment when the game will fundamentally change and is being actively worked on right now for the future. Another thing being actively worked on is the Gen 12 renderer. Here, the engine and graphics programmers are deprecating the DirectX 11 renderer and streamlining it under Vulkan. This is important as the parallelization of the render thread, draw calls, and memory management enabled by Vulkan will dramatically speed up the game, as the game is rather CPU limited at the moment as the main render thread is rather overburdened. With Vulkan, players with beefier, many-cored PCs like the amazing Ryzen 3900X I have will see decidedly higher minimum frame rates, and in the future they will have better control over render distances for shadows and level of detail. Since I was also curious, I also asked about GPU-related features that Vulkan could entail. In discussion with the Director of Graphics Engineering at CIG, Ali Brown, he identified variable rate shading as a straightforward win that the team definitely want to integrate as soon as Vulkan's in the game. Regarding Vulkan ray tracing for RDNA 2 GPUs or Turing GPUs, he mentioned that they definitely want to integrate it, but the exact effects they would want are up in the air. Ray Trace GI would be a killer feature, but to implement it would require double the work to make sure the standard version of the game lighting does not look radically different than the GI version. On the other hand, shadows and ambient occlusion are more straightforward quality wins that would require less QA testing and art passes. For me though, I'm hoping they just throw caution to the wind and implement Ray Trace GI. All that sweet asset detail with amazing looking proper indirect lighting would be awesome. So there you have it. Cloud Imperium Games have created some unique workflows to maintain high amounts of detail while not destroying GPUs and CPUs. And I found it an incredible opportunity to talk to them in their studio and learn how it all works. Now I just have to wait for subsequent releases to see how server meshing is integrated and exactly how Vulkan integration will turn out. And until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then please consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you enjoyed this mini-series on Star Citizen and would like to see more content like this, please support us on Patreon, as that enables us to make videos like this in the future. If you want to talk to me about any of the content of this video, write a comment below or follow me in Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.